A case that shocked America. America has witnessed many horrifying crimes, but the story of the killer Marcus Aldridge sent shockwaves through the nation in 2008. With a brutal nature and a mysterious background, Marcus left behind a haunting trail of crimes, ranging from kidnapping and assault to mass murder. Here is the full account of his story and how the American justice system brought this demon to a halt. The background of the case. It was January 12, 2008, a cold, gloomy winter afternoon in Chicago, Illinois. The streets were silent, with the chilling breeze brushing past every corner of the city. At around 4:30 p.m., an urgent call came into the local police department. The voice on the line belonged to a security guard stationed near an abandoned industrial zone on the outskirts of the city. He spoke hurriedly, his breathing shallow. "There's a vehicle, a truck, engulfed in flames in the parking area. You need to come, now." When the responding officers arrived, the fire was already consuming the vehicle, filling the air with acrid smoke. The scene itself was eerie, like a setting straight out of a horror movie. The charred skeleton of the truck stood silently in the bitter cold, and the snowfall that had blanketed the area seemed to mask the sinister undercurrent of what was about to unfold. From first glance, the situation seemed like an unfortunate incident. Perhaps a stolen vehicle purposely set ablaze to erase evidence. But as the flames died down and the investigative team combed through what was left of the truck, the case took a grim turn. They discovered the scorched remains of a human body hidden in the trunk. A woman. Her identity was unknown, her face unrecognizable. It was a crime scene that would haunt even the most seasoned detectives. The forensic team worked under the cold, sterile light of spotlights brought in to illuminate the desolate area. One of the officers at the scene later described it as, "the kind of night you feel creeping into your bones, a night where every shadow seems to carry a secret." As they gathered evidence, two strange details stood out. The first was a small melted silver ring that had been left on the ground outside the driver's side, possibly dropped in haste. The second was a faint set of fingerprints smeared across the driver's door. Though they were partially burned, detectives hoped there was enough left to run through the database. Word quickly spread through the Chicago police precinct. Veteran officers recognized the methodology. This was no spontaneous crime. It was planned, calculated. The victim had signs of restraint on her wrists, deep puncture wounds indicating vicious assault, and evidence that she had been brutally stabbed before death. This grotesque discovery set into motion a citywide investigation that involved not only local law enforcement but federal agencies like the FBI as well. The possibility of a serial killer lurking in one of America's most populated cities sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Chicago, a city all too familiar with crime, had not seen anything of this caliber in years. Tensions ran high as detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle of who this woman was, and more importantly, who had done this to her. Detective James Harper, one of Chicago's most revered homicide investigators, was among the first to take the lead. Harper, a man who had seen the darkest sides of humanity in his career, admitted later, "Something about that scene was different. It felt personal, like the killer wanted to make sure we all knew just how much pain they'd inflicted on her." With the brutal Chicago winter as their backdrop, the team began its relentless pursuit to unravel the victim's identity and the killer's twisted motives. The leads were scant. No missing persons report seemed to match the timeline, and despite running the fingerprints found at the scene, no immediate matches turned up in the national database. The media, as always, was quick to latch onto the sensationalism of the case. "Chicago's darkest winter" was the headline splashed across the morning newspapers. The city, already plagued with urban crime, felt the collective unease settle in. As more information surfaced about the manner in which this woman had been killed, residents began to fear that a killer was on the loose, one who might strike again without warning. The haunting question remained: was this a one-time act of horrific violence, or was this just the beginning of a killing spree that no one had yet foreseen? All anyone could do was wait. And for the Chicago PD, every passing second felt like the edge of a ticking clock they couldn't seem to stop. The victim's identity and the first break in the case. For almost a week, the identity of the burned woman remained a chilling mystery. Detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle, starting with what little evidence they had. The melted silver ring and the badly degraded fingerprints provided the smallest slivers of hope. As days passed, the clock seemed to tick louder, pressuring the Chicago PD to unravel this macabre enigma before panic set in further. Finally, a breakthrough came. Using cutting-edge forensic techniques, analysts were able to partially reconstruct the fingerprints on the driver's door and match them with a national database entry. The results came in during the late hours of January 18, 2008. The victim was confirmed to be Emily Grant, a 27-year-old waitress who had worked at a well-known diner in the downtown area. Detectives wasted no time in investigating Emily's background. She was described by co-workers as kind-hearted, hard-working, and reserved. She came in, did her job, and never really talked much about her personal life, a co-worker noted. Emily didn't have any immediate family in the area, her parents lived in Michigan, and she appeared to have few close friends in Chicago. Her quiet demeanor made it all the more perplexing that she had ended up as the victim of such a brutal crime. Detective James Harper and his team delved deeper, learning that Emily had been reported missing 3 days prior, on January 15th by her landlord. She had failed to show up to work for 2 consecutive shifts and hadn't paid her rent, which was long overdue. According to the landlord, Emily was always punctual for everything, including rent payments. The sudden silence from her had immediately raised concern. Piecing together surveillance footage from her neighborhood, detectives caught their first glimpse of Emily in the days leading up to the murder. It showed her exiting her apartment building around 9 p.m. on January 12th, the same day her body was discovered. Curious details began to emerge. Emily was dressed in casual but slightly disheveled clothing, carrying a small bag. She got into a vehicle, a blue sedan, parked just outside her building. Interestingly, the plate numbers couldn't be seen clearly, but the driver was a man. Tracking down witnesses proved difficult given the neighborhood's transient nature. However, one observer, a parking attendant on the same street, mentioned seeing the car earlier that same evening. The guy driving looked normal, nothing stood out. But the way she got in the car, she looked hesitant, kinda nervous, the attendant recalled. This single statement began to paint a picture of a woman who may have known her attacker but wasn't entirely comfortable around him. As detectives retraced her steps, they uncovered yet another detail. Emily had received a phone call earlier on January 12th at 8:30 p.m. from a prepaid cell phone, a so-called burner phone. The call lasted only 2 minutes, but investigators believed this was arranged as the lead-up to her meeting with the unknown man in the blue sedan. One detective on the team later commented, "It gave off the vibe of a date gone wrong, or maybe someone lured her under false pretenses, but we were dealing with a ghost. Whoever called her was masking their identity heavily." Emily's eventual death wasn't just a headline, it painted an urgent, oppressive fear across Chicago. Her co-workers at the diner shared anecdotes of an Emily who always seemed troubled in recent months. "She wasn't the Emily we first hired," her manager recounted. "There was something weighing her down, a kind of sadness. And then one day, I remember asking her if she was okay and she just smiled, shook her head and said, 'People like me don't get happy endings.' It stuck with me when I heard what happened." But alongside the sorrow surrounding Emily's story, deeper questions arose. Who was the man driving the blue sedan? What had prompted Emily to leave her apartment that night? Most chillingly, why was her murder carried out with such deliberate cruelty? Detectives knew one thing. The murder wasn't a crime of passion or impulse. The evidence from the crime scene, including signs of physical restraint and extensive injuries inflicted prior to her death, pointed to a methodical, cold-blooded monster. And then, of course, there was the arson. "The fire was staged," said Detective Harper during a press conference. "It was meant to destroy evidence. Whoever did this, they knew what they were doing." The discovery of Emily's identity breathed new life into the investigation. Detectives began pulling every thread of her life, hoping to unravel the connections that might explain her tragic end. Her phone records, finances, and social media profiles became areas of immediate focus. The burner phone that contacted her remained unreachable, but investigators believed that tracking its origin down could offer a major lead. What was most striking, however, were Emily's bank transactions. 2 days before her disappearance, she had withdrawn $2,000 from her savings, a considerable sum for a struggling waitress. Her financial records further revealed that the withdrawal happened at a small ATM near her workplace. When detectives reviewed the security feed from the ATM, the footage showed Emily appearing anxious, constantly looking over her shoulder as she completed her transaction. This raised even more alarm bells. What was the money for? Was she being extorted? Did someone have leverage over her life that forced her to take such a large amount out? And if so, what secrets lay buried in her hushed world? Just as investigators thought they were closing in, the case took another unexpected twist. Emily's boss mentioned an incident at the diner a week before, involving a confrontation with a disturbing customer. Witnesses remembered a tall man, well-dressed yet oddly intense in his demeanor, who had berated Emily in front of patrons. He left quickly but not before muttering something under his breath, something like, "You'll regret this." Could this man be the attacker? Was he connected to the mysterious phone call luring her into a car that fateful night? And most importantly, were there more heinous plans lurking in his shadow, waiting to strike again? Whoever killed Emily didn't stop there, Detective Harper grimly stated in a tense meeting with his team. This wasn't random, it was deliberate, calculated. This may be one victim, but we could easily end up chasing a predator with a thirst for more. And as the detectives continued peeling back the layers of Emily's haunting and tragic life, the dark undercurrent, pulling her into this web of violence, grew ever more tangible. The mysterious disappearances. The unsettling discovery of Emily Grant's body was only the beginning. Over the course of the following 3 weeks, the city of Chicago was gripped by another wave of fear, as 2 additional women were reported missing under eerily similar circumstances. Both women were young, in their late 20s to early 30s, lived alone, and had no significant history of trouble with the law or known enemies. With each case, the sense that Chicago had a deeply dangerous predator hunting its streets became more pronounced. The first woman to be reported missing after Emily was Sarah Avery, a 3rd-grade teacher from Humboldt Park. On January 20, 2008, Sarah's sister, who lived out of state, contacted the police after failing to reach Sarah for 3 days. Her calls went straight to voicemail, which her sister found strange because Sarah was the kind of person who always picked up her phone. The unsettling detail came when Sarah failed to show up at her school for 2 consecutive days without notifying anyone, something she had never done in her career. Her car was still parked outside her apartment, and her mail was untouched. Detectives investigated her small 1-bedroom apartment, which looked ordinary at first glance. Her shoes were still by the door, the television remote sat on the armrest of her couch mid-action, as though sitting untouched for days. But then, an odd detail threw detectives off: the dining table. One end of the table was clearly scrubbed cleaner than the rest and still wet from some kind of solution. It wasn't enough to thrill a forensic team, but enough to leave a mark. Could Sarah have been lured, perhaps even taken from her own home? The last communication from Sarah came through her work email time-stamped at 8:24 p.m. on January 17th. Beyond this, she had seemingly vanished without a trace. A search of her neighborhood produced minimal leads. Bystanders remembered seeing Sarah walking her dog days earlier, but no one reported hearing anything unusual. Nothing about her life suggested a reason to run away. She was one of the sweetest people you could meet, Sarah's colleague at work told reporters during the growing media storm. Always early to school, always smiling. If someone's taken her, it's just evil. If the city was on edge from Sarah's sudden disappearance, the anxiety broke into outright panic 4 days later. On January 24th, police confirmed another missing woman in the nearby Logan Square area. This time, it was 31-year-old Rachel Torres, an up-and-coming freelance journalist known for her investigative reports about crime in the city. Rachel had no family connections in Chicago and worked irregular hours, often taking last-minute assignments. It wasn't unusual for her friends not to hear from her for short periods. However, when her editor reached out regarding an important missed deadline, concern grew. Rachel's neighbors reported seeing her return home late on the night of January 22nd, likely from a dinner meeting. A few hours later, someone recalled hearing faint screaming from her apartment complex, though by the time anyone thought to investigate, everything had gone silent. The next morning, Rachel's car was still in her assigned parking spot in the building's lot. Yet, her front door remained ajar. Inside her apartment, splatters of something red, possibly wine or blood, marked the floor near her bed. The forensic teams were called in immediately, and what they found was chilling. Strands of hair that seemed to have been yanked violently from someone's head, a bloody handprint on the window-facing wall, and subtle scratches on the door's interior, as though someone had been dragged out against their will. Detective Harper and his team were deeply shaken by the developments. "This couldn't be a coincidence, there's a pattern forming here," Harper stated during an internal briefing. The missing women all shared a fairly regular pattern. Those who kept to themselves appeared to have ordinary lives and disappeared without any major witnesses to speak to. The media dubbed the mysterious attacker the Shadow, a name that quickly gained notoriety as fear blanketed the city. Reports of the disappearances dominated evening newscasts, and social media was flooded with speculation. Some theorized that each victim might have known their captor, or had been stalked before their disappearance. Others quickly turned to Chicago's crime statistics, helplessly trying to piece together how such brutal cases could connect. But the case wasn't without glimmers of hope. Investigators were starting to notice a chilling similarity in traces of communication before each disappearance. Just as Emily had been contacted by a disposable burner phone, both Sarah and Rachel had each received a mysterious call days before they vanished. In Rachel's case, cell tower triangulation revealed the call originated from a rural area several miles south of Chicago, far away from where she was taken. Police were convinced now that this wasn't random, it was planned, calculated. A methodical figure lurking somewhere, waiting for the perfect time to strike. An even more bizarre thread began to emerge during Rachel's investigation. She had been working on an undercover story regarding a string of recent reports about suspicious individuals lurking near schools, churches, and community centers on Chicago's South Side. While this lead hadn't been publicly tied to Rachel's disappearance, her editor admitted that Rachel had expressed increased stress in the weeks leading up to the incident. Could her journalism work have directly put her in harm's way? While detectives scrambled to make sense of the overlapping connections, a more puzzling and sinister detail emerged. Forensic analysis of a footprint found near Sarah Avery's apartment matched a partial shoe print found at Rachel's scene. The shoe was an uncommon size, narrow in width and corresponding to an outdated design that hadn't been on the market for over 10 years. Each clue only deepened the investigators' belief that these were the work of a single individual, someone meticulous and controlled. As Harper noted grimly, this wasn't about opportunity. This was about obsession. While the public demanded answers and coverage of the case intensified, the Chicago PD refused to make rash conclusions. "We don't have a serial killer yet," Harper said during a press conference, his voice heavy with hesitation, "but we are investigating every possibility. Please, if you see anything out of the ordinary, call us." Despite the announcements of caution, the growing anxiety across Chicago was impossible to ignore. Streets emptied as early as sunset, women no longer felt safe venturing out alone, and the sales of personal safety devices skyrocketed. While some chose to stay inside and barricade their homes, others whispered questions they dared not ask aloud. How many more would go missing? And worse, were their bodies lying burned in unseen places like Emily's? As Chicago braced itself for another blow, detectives worked around the clock, pushing every possible lead to its breaking point. They knew time was their worst enemy now. A lurking predator only grew bolder with patience. The suspect emerges. The turning point in the investigation came unexpectedly, and escalated the sense of both relief and dread among the detectives. After weeks of chasing down leads and matching seemingly random pieces of evidence, the Chicago Police Department finally found a break when a surviving witness, Jessica Harper, stepped forward with information that would change the course of the case. Jessica Harper had narrowly escaped a harrowing encounter with the suspected killer. A 32-year-old art teacher from the West Loop, Harper had been abducted less than 2 days prior, but somehow managed to escape her captor's hold, in what can only be described as an extraordinary stroke of willpower and luck. Shaken but alive, Jessica provided detectives with a description of the man who had haunted her. "I woke up in a room, some dingy, windowless place. I couldn't tell where I was, but the smell, God, it was rancid, like chemicals and something rotting," Jessica recounted, her voice trembling as she sat across from Detective Harper and his team in a dimly lit questioning suite. "I don't know how I got there. The last thing I remember was being in my car, parking outside of my studio. Then there was this sharp pain in my neck. After that, nothing until I woke up." The details of her story were chilling. Jessica described a man in his late 30s or early 40s, white, standing about 6 feet tall, lean but with a muscular build. Most disturbingly, she remembered the jagged scar that ran from his wrist up to his elbow on his left arm. He wasn't just cruel, Jessica added with a hollow gaze. He was calm about it, like he'd done it 100 times, like he enjoyed it. She revealed that the man had restrained her with duct tape and zip ties, leaving her bound to a makeshift chair in that decrepit room. "He asked me weird questions, personal ones," she said. "He wanted to know about my family, who would miss me if I just disappeared." The man she described was cautious but confident, methodical yet sadistic. Jessica remembered him saying just before leaving the room, "You're lucky, you might survive this, most of them don't." That statement alone made Jessica sure that he had done this before, and many times at that. Her miraculous escape happened during what appeared to be an unexpected stroke of his overconfidence. After leaving her restrained but untethered in the room for what felt like hours, Jessica managed to wriggle free of the duct tape on her wrists. Realizing he hadn't returned yet, she mustered the courage to stumble through an unguarded side door that led to an alley. She ran barefoot for nearly 6 blocks before a resident on the south side called 911. As Jessica's story unfolded, a composite sketch of the suspect was drawn and circulated among local and federal law enforcement. It showed a pale-faced man with sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, and a deeply unsettling blank expression. The scar on his arm became the key identifying feature that set him apart from the average suspect profile. The local news ran the sketch alongside a dire warning for Chicago's residents. If you see anyone resembling this man, do not approach. Call the police immediately. Meanwhile, detectives reviewed the clues leading up to Jessica's kidnapping alongside the previous disappearances. They cross-referenced her account with fragments of evidence from Emily Grant's case, the burner phones, the possibility of a blue sedan, and now her testimony of duct tape and zip ties, an eerie connection to the binding marks found on Emily's wrists. This wasn't just a predator. This was a predator with a system. Then came the bombshell discovery. Forensic experts revisited the partially burned fingerprints found on the door handle of the vehicle where Emily's body had been discovered. Using newly accessible advanced reconstruction technology, detectives confirmed a partial match to prints entered in a neighboring state's database years prior. The match pointed to a man, Marcus Aldridge, a name that, at first, would have gone unnoticed in a crowded database until now. Marcus Aldridge was no ordinary suspect. At 39 years old, Aldridge had a history of fleetingly suspicious activities but no criminal record substantial enough to warrant jail time. Born and raised in Indianapolis, Aldridge had briefly worked in tech as an IT specialist for a large software company. Records showed he had been fired back in 2004 after allegations of stalking a colleague. Although no significant charges followed from the incident, Aldridge's apparent downward spiral began shortly thereafter. Following his termination, his online footprint became increasingly enigmatic. Investigators scoured old internet forums, encrypted chat rooms, and obscure technology-related pages that he frequented, revealing posts that hinted at a disturbing obsession with cleansing chaos and theories about human nature's darker impulses. In one of the forums, Aldridge, under the username Idolonic, wrote, "Pain is art. Control comes when someone has nothing left to lose. That's when they become pure." Detective Harper, now laser-focused on Marcus Aldridge, obtained a search warrant for his last known address, a deteriorated multi-unit building on the outskirts of Chicago. Neighbors described him as quiet and aloof, often seen but rarely engaging with anyone. "Used to keep weird hours," a neighbor recalled, smoking on her front porch, always in and out at night like a ghost. What police found at his former residence was nothing short of horrifying. Although Aldridge appeared to have cleared out weeks prior, traces of his activities lingered. In the unit's barely furnished living room, a wooden chair similar to Jessica's description sat in the center of the room. Duct tape and zip ties, much like those used on Jessica, were strewn on the table nearby. Most chillingly, a collection of notebooks filled the bottom drawer of an old dresser. Inside those pages were crude sketches of women, faces twisted in terror, beside fragmented journal entries detailing methods of binding, pain thresholds, and something repeatedly referred to as the ultimate moment. Investigators would later describe the notebooks as the blueprint to Aldridge's sickening psyche. And then, there was the blue sedan. Found abandoned in a junkyard less than 10 miles from his last address, the car had been wiped clean of most evidence. But they didn't miss everything. Inside the trunk, investigators recovered strands of hair matching Rachel Torres, the missing journalist. Blood splatter analysis tied back to Sarah Avery, the missing teacher. The chain tightened around Aldridge like a noose. "This isn't just another case," Harper muttered grimly to his team during a late-night briefing. "This guy isn't just a predator, he's an architect of fear." Now the focus shifted. Marcus Aldridge wasn't the shadow lurking in Chicago anymore. He had a face, a story, and detectives had one single goal: to catch him before someone else vanished into the darkness. Marcus Aldridge, the devil in disguise. On the surface, Marcus Aldridge appeared to be an unremarkable man. Someone who could blend seamlessly into the bustling streets of any American city. Neighbors from his earlier residences described him as polite and reserved, though occasionally standoffish. A man who kept to himself, rarely made eye contact, and maintained a schedule that seemed oddly erratic. To those who passed him on the street or worked alongside him during his years as an IT specialist for a prominent tech company in Indianapolis, Marcus was forgettable, unassuming, invisibly ordinary, but beneath the veneer of normalcy lay the psyche of a predator, carefully honed and wholly detached from the humanity surrounding him. Marcus Aldridge wasn't just a man who committed heinous crimes, he was a master illusionist, a figure who wore the mask of civility while hiding his monstrous tendencies just out of sight. A promising start, and a dark spiral. Born in 1969 on the outskirts of Indianapolis, Marcus was the second son of a middle-class family. His father, a strict and emotionally distant man, worked as a machinist, while his mother, a devoutly religious woman, stayed home to take care of him and his older brother David. Those close to the Aldridge family recall little warmth in the household. The father's discipline was harsh, and the mother's upbringing of the boys often bordered on fanatical. Marcus, by all accounts, was a reclusive child who thrived academically, but struggled to form meaningful relationships. Teachers noted his exceptional intelligence in mathematics and technology. He excelled in engineering and computer science during his high school and college years, even earning a scholarship to a highly respected university. "He was the kind of kid you saw doing big things in life," said a former professor when interviewed years later. "But I remember thinking back then that he was different. Not different in an obvious way, but he had this coldness to him. He asked strange questions sometimes, philosophical, but in a way that made you wonder if he understood the answers." Marcus eventually graduated in the top 5% of his class and secured a competitive position at a large tech company in Indianapolis. At work, he was described as meticulous, detail-oriented to an obsessive fault. For a time, he seemed to lead an unremarkable life, one that revolved around computer programming and solving problems for corporate clients. But cracks in his facade became apparent over time. Colleagues started noticing unsettling behavior. There were hushed complaints of Marcus invading personal boundaries, lingering too long in the shadows of office corridors, and an intensity in his gaze that never quite matched his mild words. One co-worker, Allison Reed, later recounted an incident to law enforcement when Marcus casually brought up the concept of control during a lunch break conversation. "He asked me if I believed in free will," Reed recalled, "and when I said yes, he smiled this empty smile and said something like, 'Free will is an illusion. The strongest one in the room is the one really pulling the strings.' It was so strange that I just laughed it off, but afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it." Then came the incident that would end his professional career. In 2004, Marcus was accused of stalking a female co-worker, a programmer named Hannah Carter. Found loitering near her car after work and sending her cryptic, unnerving emails, Marcus faced disciplinary action. Although Hannah never pursued criminal charges, fearing the stigma of filing harassment claims at the office, Marcus was quietly terminated before the situation escalated further. This moment marked the beginning of his spiral into obscurity and into darkness. The creation of a monster. After losing his job, Marcus withdrew entirely from public life. He disappeared into poorly kept rental apartments, taking on sporadic freelance IT gigs that barely kept him afloat. His apartment became something of a hermit's crypt, filled with discarded fast food wrappers, malfunctioning electronic equipment, and ominous journals detailing his descent into madness. Investigators who later uncovered his writings described them as both meticulous and horrifying. "He meticulously recorded his thoughts," Detective Harper stated at a press briefing. "It wasn't rambling or chaotic, it was controlled, calculated. He seemed utterly fascinated with the idea of suffering and the limits of human endurance. He wrote about power, about how pain could strip someone of their sense of self, leaving behind only what he called purity." Online, Marcus adopted numerous pseudonyms and became active in dark corners of the internet. Using one of his handles, Eidolonic, he frequented forums dedicated to philosophical debates about morality, domination, and control. His posts hinted at his growing obsession with experimenting, first hypothetically, but soon in tangible ways. "Pain is the only constant, control is creation. To destroy is to create anew," he wrote in one now infamous message. While his cryptic postings disturbed some in these shadowy communities, they were dismissed as the ramblings of an eccentric or a loner. No one imagined the horrifying reality unfolding in his small Chicago-area apartment, a double life of deception. A key element to Marcus's ability to evade authorities for so long was his extreme attention to detail. Living off the radar, he understood how to manipulate systems to his advantage: burner phones, cash-only transactions, and fake names kept his footprint virtually non-existent. Indeed, Marcus had seemingly perfected the art of blending in when it mattered most. He frequented hardware stores and online marketplaces under aliases, purchasing small but telling items: duct tape, zip ties, bleach, prepaid SIM cards. Each purchase was meaningless on its own but chilling when pieced together after the fact. Neighbors and store employees later recalled a man who was polite but forgettable. "He wasn't threatening," one clerk said. "He didn't stand out. That's what's so terrifying, isn't it? He could have been anyone." But despite his careful planning, Marcus's growing thirst for control and domination pushed him further and further into the open. Investigators believe his fall into active violence began 3 years before his arrest, with his first confirmed victim surfacing in 2006, a woman reported missing and found months later in neighboring Indiana under gruesome circumstances. At the time, no connection was made to Marcus Aldridge, and the truth behind the angelic facade. While Marcus Aldridge may have appeared mild-mannered and even pitiable to those on the surface, no shred of humanity seemed to exist within him. To his victims, he was the embodiment of terror. He set out to deceive the world, to create a guise of harmlessness while operating in secrecy, preying upon women he believed no one would look for or care about. Detective Harper described Marcus in visceral terms during an internal meeting. "What makes him exceptional in the most horrifying way is the dichotomy of his existence. Outwardly, he's just this guy, a quiet recluse with a tech background, but underneath he's a ticking bomb, a mastermind of suffering and cruelty with no regard for anyone but himself." What the team discovered about Marcus Aldridge reinforced how deceptive evil can truly be. He wasn't just a criminal, he was an artist of atrocity, a man who found meaning only in destruction. The thought still haunts those who uncovered the truth. Marcus was never unassuming. He was just waiting for a moment to strike. The barbaric methods. As the investigation into Marcus Aldridge deepened, one horrifying fact became abundantly clear. He was no ordinary killer. His crimes weren't just a means to an end, they were an art form to him, a ritual shrouded in meticulous planning and sinister precision. What made Aldridge's actions truly monstrous wasn't just the violence itself, but the deeply deliberate and sadistic methods he employed to carry out his atrocities. The hallmarks of horror forensic teams and investigators were able to identify chilling consistencies across the crime scenes linked to Marcus. His victims were always restrained in a similar manner. Duct tape tightly wrapped around their wrists and ankles, zip ties aggressively applied over the tape like a cruel insurance policy against freedom. Bruising patterns suggested that the bindings were so tight they often severed circulation within hours, leaving the victims in excruciating pain before anything else had even begun. The locations of his crimes were equally deliberate. Marcus seemed to favor desolate, abandoned properties, places where no one would interrupt him, and no screams would be heard beyond the hollowed-out walls. Investigators found these sites almost ritualistically prepared, a sinister blend of makeshift torture chambers and crime scenes designed to erase evidence and leave behind only fear and suffering. Each site seemed to tell an unspoken story, a carefully staged tableau of Marcus's depravity. One of the abandoned buildings discovered during the investigation still carried the telltale signs of his presence. A single spotlight hung from the exposed ceiling beams, casting a harsh glow on a worn wooden chair in the center of the room. Duct tape fragments littered the floor, along with traces of bleach and cleaning solutions, confirming Marcus's obsession with hiding his tracks. A forensic specialist later remarked, "It wasn't just a crime scene, it was his stage. Everything he did here was deliberate, as if this wasn't murder, but theater." Psychological torture. Marcus wasn't content with simply taking lives. His methods suggested a deep, almost scientific interest in inflicting psychological pain before the physical. Survivors like Jessica Harper described chilling accounts of being interrogated by Marcus about their personal lives. He pried into their fears, forcing them to confront the fragility of their existence. "He asked me questions I wish I could forget," Jessica revealed during her harrowing testimony. "He wanted to know what mattered most to me, what I held on to in life, and then he'd smirk as if he was planning to take those things away." For Marcus, his killings weren't just acts of control, they were experiments. His notes and journals discovered later contained detailed descriptions of his victims' expressions, their reactions to pain, and even his own feelings during the crimes. In one particularly haunting entry, Marcus wrote, "It's not about the act of killing. It's about the moment where they realize they've lost everything. That's when they're truly pure, free of hope, free of lies, free of the illusion of safety. The element of fire. Perhaps the most grotesque element of Marcus's methods was his use of fire to destroy evidence and obliterate any trace of his victims. Fire wasn't just a tool to him. It was a symbol, a consuming force of finality. Every body discovered in his wake had suffered the same horrifying fate, burned beyond recognition. Investigators would later uncover his pattern of meticulously planning each arson, ensuring the flames would mask not only his crimes, but the identity of his victims. Fire investigators noted alarming consistencies in how Marcus staged the blazes. He used accelerants such as gasoline, carefully poured to ensure the fire spread quickly and utterly consumed the remains. He placed his victims in vehicles, abandoned buildings, or isolated outdoor locations to maximize the fire's intensity while minimizing the risk of being spotted. One fire marshal described the burn sites as textbook. It's what you'd see from a trained professional. It was clear that Marcus's technical background played an unsettling role in his ability to carry out these acts unnoticed. However, the use of fire wasn't only practical, it was theatrical. Arson became Marcus's signature, a way to obscure his identity while inflicting one final act of total annihilation on his victims. To him it was almost ceremonial, the end of the process, leaving nothing behind but ash and charred remains, the tools of a predator. Inside Marcus's final residence, police uncovered what they referred to as a killer's toolbox. This modest two-bedroom apartment housed items no ordinary person would think to keep, at least not together. Investigators found duct tape rolls in bulk, expensive surgical gloves, lengths of rope, industrial-strength bleach, and a variety of sharp objects ranging from box cutters to hunting knives. But the most chilling discovery was his collection of custom-modified tools, including clamps, pliers, and other devices seemingly designed to inflict maximum pain without immediate death. Forensic experts later revealed that many of these tools bore traces of blood and hair from multiple victims. It confirmed what many feared. Marcus had taken his time with his victims. He orchestrated their pain, prolonging their suffering for hours, or longer. Detective Harper remarked grimly, "He didn't just kill because he needed to, he killed because he wanted to feel something. Power, dominance, call it what you will, but pain was his goal." The calculated use of fear. Beyond the physical torment Marcus inflicted, fear was his ultimate weapon. Survivors and witnesses spoke of the overwhelming sense of helplessness he created in his victims. His composed demeanor and cold, calculating approach made him all the more terrifying. There was no moment of rage, no loss of control. Every word he spoke, every action he took, was meant to remind his victims of one single horrifying truth. He was in control. Jessica Harper recalled how Marcus would pace around her, almost casual, as if he were having coffee instead of holding her life in his hands. "He talked to me like I wasn't even human," she said, "like I was just some object he owned, and the scariest part was how calm he was. His voice never shook, his hands never trembled. It felt like he'd done this 100 times before." Marcus's ability to manipulate fear extended beyond his victims to the communities left reeling in the wake of his crimes. With each disappearance, each murder, and each blaze that lit up the Chicago night, he plunged an entire city into paranoia. Streets emptied earlier, and residents whispered about the shadow lurking among them. His calculated brutality wasn't just directed at individuals, he turned entire neighborhoods into places of dread, the legacy of a predator's methods. What investigators uncovered, a series of deliberate, sadistic techniques, painted a horrifying picture of Marcus Aldridge, not as a man driven by an uncontrollable urge, but as a predator who chose his every action with care and precision. His methods weren't random acts of violence, they were premeditated maneuvers that blurred the line between cold rationality and utter madness. It became abundantly clear to those pursuing him that Marcus Aldridge thrived in the darkness, honed, deliberate, and utterly remorseless. He had no need for chaos to disguise his work, nor any impulses driving reckless behavior. No, Marcus was something far more dangerous, a predator who hunted for the sake of the hunt and a meticulous craftsman of terror. The high-stakes manhunt. By mid-February of 2008, Marcus Aldridge had become the focus of one of the largest manhunts in recent American history. His crimes had already horrified Chicago and beyond, leaving a trail of terror across multiple states. For weeks, law enforcement agencies led by Detective James Harper and the Chicago PD had followed scattered clues, hoping for a break in the case. But now, with Marcus identified, his every move became an urgent and deadly puzzle. The problem was, Marcus Aldridge was no ordinary fugitive. He was meticulous, resourceful, and maddeningly elusive. Each time the police seemed to get closer, Marcus appeared to be several steps ahead. His ability to slip through their grasp wasn't accidental. It was the product of a sinister mind, honed for stalking, deceiving, and disappearing. Detective Harper and his team knew this wasn't a man who would allow himself to be caught easily. To apprehend Marcus, they'd need to think like him, anticipate his steps, and stitch together every fragment of evidence before he struck again. A city on edge. By February 15, 2008, Marcus had been added to the FBI's most wanted list, making him a fugitive on a national scale. Flyers with his mugshot, his pale, angular face and infamous scar, were posted in public spaces across Chicago and nearby states. Law enforcement went as far as putting his image on digital billboards to alert the public. Beneath his photo, the words, "armed and extremely dangerous," were prominently displayed. Every lead mattered. Gas station surveillance tapes were combed through, toll booth records reviewed, and traffic cameras scrutinized for his blue sedan before it had been abandoned. Detectives tracked sales records of duct tape, gasoline, and other tools Marcus had been known to use in his crimes, yet for every piece of new information Marcus remained infuriatingly one step ahead. The public's fear reached a fever pitch. News anchors spoke in ominous tones about the Shadow Killer, their reports loaded with speculation and terror. In Chicago, no one wanted to go out after dark. Even grocery store parking lots, places bustling before the murders, were eerily empty as the sun set. Women took self-defense classes in panicked droves, while sales of pepper spray, tasers, and personal alarms soared. The fear wasn't just about Marcus's past crimes, it was about the haunting urgency that he was still out there, planning his next move. And worse, he had already proven he could cross state lines. This wasn't a killer confined to Chicago anymore. This was a fugitive with no boundaries. Chasing shadows, federal agents from the FBI joined forces with local law enforcement, deploying advanced tracking technology alongside old-fashioned detective work. They installed roadblocks at major state lines, monitored bus depots and train stations, and searched warehouses, motels, and abandoned properties. Anonymous tips poured in, but the reality was stark. Marcus was a ghost, always vanishing before agents could close in. One chilling discovery came on February 22nd in a small Missouri town when a motel clerk alerted police to a strange guest who had paid in cash and checked out abruptly, leaving behind a destroyed prepaid phone in the trash. The phone was traced back to Marcus. In the room, detectives found strands of hair and bloodstains on a pillowcase, suggesting Marcus had been planning another attack, one that had been interrupted. "What we're hunting is a man who thrives in shadows," Harper revealed grimly at a press conference a day later. "He doesn't just avoid light, he disappears before the light even has a chance to find him." But the race wasn't just against Marcus. It was against time. Each passing day risked another victim. Harper's team worked around the clock, piecing together his timeline from interviews, surveillance footage, and forensic data. Yet, the more they uncovered, the more unsettling it became. Marcus timed every move. His purchases weren't random. His destinations weren't accidents. At any moment he could vanish into obscurity, leaving nothing but the haunting void he always did. The psychological gamble. As Harper scrutinized Marcus's journals and old internet posts, one alarming insight emerged. Marcus didn't just see his victims as targets, he saw his pursuit as a game. To him, this wasn't a desperate effort to flee from justice, it was an opportunity to test the limits of the system hunting him. "Marcus prepares for everything," Harper told his team during one of their late-night briefings. "He anticipates reactions, he leaves breadcrumbs to distract us. To catch a man like this, we can't just chase him, we have to make him believe he's in control, while steering him into a trap of our own." The gamble involved everything the FBI could muster, including profiling experts who studied Marcus's patterns. With each crime, there had been consistency, deliberate cruelty masked with obsessive precision. The abandoned buildings, the burner phones, the staged fires. Marcus wasn't chaotic, he was methodical, but his one Achilles heel was his need for control, and Harper planned to exploit that. The close calls. In early March, police closed in on a car matching Marcus's new description, an older gray sedan purchased under an alias, in rural Kentucky. Local law enforcement joined the chase after the car fled a routine traffic stop. For nearly 30 minutes, patrol cars followed the speeding vehicle, sirens blaring. But before they could intercept him, Marcus swerved down a narrow, forested road, abandoning the car. K-9 units swept the woods for hours, but by dawn, all traces of him were gone. The only clue left behind? Nail-biting scratches along the car seatbelts, likely left by a victim who had been held there. The chase resumed days later when a farmer in Ohio found evidence of squatters in an abandoned barn on his property. Investigators uncovered signs Marcus had stayed there, wrappers from fast food diners in Missouri, receipts for camping gear, and chilling fragments of what appeared to be another written manifesto. One passage read, "They'll never see it coming, the world is their lie, I am its truth." Laying the trap, Harper's team eventually concocted a plan, one designed to trap a manipulator like Marcus. They leaked controlled, false information to the press, suggesting they were closing in on him in a heavily surveilled industrial zone near Indianapolis, a place Marcus had ties to from his past. The idea was to force Marcus to distance himself from locations he might otherwise occupy, pushing him toward less guarded escape routes where agents were quietly waiting just out of sight. The trap nearly sprang on March 20th when Marcus used an ATM just miles from the Arizona-Mexico border. The transaction flagged the FBI's system, alerting agents nearby. Marcus had withdrawn nearly all the cash in the account. He was preparing to run. Harper's team knew this was their final window. If Marcus crossed the border, their search could drag on for months, even years. "All units mobilized," Harper snapped as his team threw themselves into action. The final standoff. The showdown came on March 25, 2008, at a worn-down rest stop in the Arizona desert. Word had reached a nearby patrol officer that a man fitting Marcus's description had been seen abandoning a car in the area. As agents zeroed in, Marcus attempted to flee, blending into the travelers milling about the station. When law enforcement finally cornered him, he snarled with a cold smile as if amused by their efforts. But his bag told the real story. Inside was everything Harper's team feared: rope, duct tape, zip ties, and small blades, all components of Marcus's twisted toolbox. It was clear he hadn't stopped. He had simply been lying in wait for the right moment. "It's over," Harper declared, as Marcus was cuffed and taken into custody. But the words, while triumphant, carried a weight. For those who had suffered at the hands of Marcus Aldridge, the scars, both physical and emotional, would last a lifetime. The Trap Springs in Arizona. By late March 2008, Marcus Aldridge had become the most wanted man in America. His face was plastered on every news station, his scarred arm an infamous mark of fear. The nation held its breath as law enforcement closed in, knowing that every passing hour brought the terrifying possibility of another victim, another haunting crime scene. Marcus had been on the run for weeks, slipping through state lines and leaving behind a trail of near captures and abandoned crime tools. His ability to disappear, to predict law enforcement's moves, had pushed detectives to their limits. But for all his cunning and resourcefulness, Marcus Aldridge was not invincible. It was in the barren deserts of Arizona, under the unforgiving March sun, that his game, and his reign of terror, finally came crashing down, tracking the shadow. Following Marcus's ATM withdrawal near the Arizona-Mexico border on March 20th, authorities were on high alert. The withdrawal was a desperate move on his part, one they knew was an attempt to fund his escape. Harper's team, working in tandem with the FBI, pieced together his likely movements. They predicted Marcus was heading south, hoping to cross the border into Mexico where extradition could become an uphill battle. "You don't drain your funds unless you're ready to disappear for good," Harper had told his team during a heated strategy session. "He's on edge. He knows we're closing in, but he thinks he still holds the upper hand." The desert landscape presented its own challenges. Vast and sparsely populated, Arizona's rugged terrain offered ample opportunities for a man like Marcus to slip into the wilderness unnoticed. Surveillance footage from nearby truck stops and rest areas provided only fleeting glimpses of someone who might be Marcus. A man with a scar, wearing an old baseball cap, face partially obscured, but never long enough for confirmation. "That's him," Harper muttered as he stared at a grainy image of a man entering a rest stop convenience store. "I can feel it. He's trying to blend in." Agents combed through every clue, analyzing his past movements. They paid close attention to rest stops, junkyards, and motels along the route leading south. These were the kind of transient, anonymous places Marcus favored, places where no one asked questions. On the morning of March 25th, a sharp-eyed patrol officer reported an abandoned silver vehicle just 15 miles north of the Arizona-Mexico border, near a remote rest stop off the beaten path. The car matched the description of the one Marcus was last seen driving. Inside the vehicle, investigators found discarded food wrappers, empty water bottles, and most chillingly, a map with various border points circled in red. Marcus's plan was clear. He wanted to cross the desert on foot, avoiding detection at the main checkpoints. "This is it," Harper said, staring at the map. "He's close. He's trying to disappear, but not this time." The rest stop incident. Arizona's sweltering midday heat bore down as law enforcement quietly descended on the dusty rest stop where Marcus was believed to be hiding. The place was desolate, apart from a few unsuspecting travelers pulling in to stretch their legs or use the restrooms. Officers dressed in plain clothes mingled with the crowd, blending in while waiting for signs of their target. "He's here," Harper whispered into his comms, scanning the area. "I know it. He didn't get far on foot. Keep it tight, and don't spook him." As the minutes ticked by, the tension grew unbearable. Every stranger inside that rest stop felt like a potential threat. Was Marcus watching them? Did he already know they were there? Harper's team moved cautiously, sweeping the area in silence, searching with trained eyes for the lone predator among the innocents. And then, they saw him. Marcus Aldridge was sitting on a bench outside the restrooms, his face shadowed by a worn baseball cap, a small duffel bag at his feet. He looked calm, eerily so. At first glance he appeared completely unremarkable, like just another weary traveler trying to escape the desert heat. But there it was, the unmistakable scar slashing across his left arm as he adjusted the bag strap. "It's him," Harper muttered into the radio. "Do not engage until we have him boxed in. No risks." The squad moved subtly into position, encircling Marcus without drawing attention from the other travelers. Harper's heart pounded as he watched the man who had haunted his thoughts for weeks. Marcus wasn't just a killer, he was a manipulator, a calculating figure who thrived on control. Even now, as Harper observed him, he marveled at Marcus's unflinching composure. "He knows," Harper thought grimly. "He knows we've found him." The arrest. When the officers moved in, Marcus didn't run. He didn't flinch. He just sat there, watching as the circle closed around him. One by one, law enforcement agents converged, their weapons drawn but their voices calm and authoritative. "Marcus Aldridge," an FBI agent barked. "Do not move! Hands where we can see them!" For a moment Marcus didn't respond. He remained eerily still, his dark eyes scanning the faces of his captors. And then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. A small, cold, almost bemused grin. "You're all so predictable," he said, his voice low and eerily steady. "Took you long enough." The officers were unshaken. They moved quickly, pulling Marcus to his feet and securing him in handcuffs. As they searched his duffel bag, their worst fears were confirmed. Inside were zip ties, duct tape, surgical gloves, and a hunting knife, tools of terror that Marcus had used time and time again. "You were planning another one," Harper whispered, stepping in front of Marcus as the rest of the team secured the area. "Weren't you?" Marcus's smile faded slightly, but his eyes remained unnervingly calm. "You think this is over, detective?" he replied, tilting his head. "It's never over. You can't stop the wheel, you'll see." Harper felt a chill run down his spine at those words, but he refused to let Marcus rattle him. "You're done," Harper said firmly. "No more victims. Not on my watch." Aftermath. The arrest of Marcus Aldridge sent shockwaves across the country. News stations ran live coverage of his capture, showing him being escorted into custody under heavy guard. The nation breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that the shadow was finally behind bars. For Harper and his team, the sense of victory was bittersweet. They had stopped a monster, but they knew the scars Marcus had inflicted on his victims and on the community would linger for years. "It's not always the ones who scream the loudest," Harper told reporters at a press conference the following day. "Sometimes the worst evil is the one that hides in plain sight. But Marcus Aldridge is no longer hiding. We made sure of that." As Marcus awaited trial, his cold, unsettling grin became the image burned into the public's memory. A reminder of how darkness can hide behind the most ordinary of faces. His capture marked the end of a terrifying chapter, but for those who had suffered at his hands, the road to healing would be a long one. The courtroom and the historic trial. On October 10, 2008, the curtain lifted on one of the most anticipated and chilling trials in modern American history, the People vs. Marcus Aldridge. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a face-off that the nation desperately wanted closure for, a moment when justice would finally confront the horror lurking behind Marcus Aldridge's cold, dark eyes. The courtroom in downtown Chicago was packed to capacity, with additional media personnel crammed into an overflow room broadcasting the proceedings live. Reporters referred to the trial as a spectacle of evil, while legal analysts dubbed it the trial of a generation. Security was tightened to the extreme, armed guards stood at every door, and even spectators underwent rigorous screening before entering. Over the weeks leading up to the event, the news cycle had scrutinized every detail about Marcus Aldridge's heinous crimes. They showed photos of his victims on news programs, young women frozen in happy moments from their lives, their bright smiles a haunting reminder of all that had been stolen. The prosecution had built its case meticulously, preparing to unveil evidence so damning it would leave no room for doubt about the monstrous nature of the man on trial. But Marcus, true to form, seemed unfazed. The devil in the room. When Marcus Aldridge entered the courtroom for the first time, there was a palpable shiver in the air. He was escorted by two imposing guards, shackled at the wrists and ankles, wearing the standard orange prison jumpsuit. But what struck everyone most was his expression, cold, emotionless, yet somehow exuding an eerie sense of control. Spectators gasped audibly the moment Marcus looked toward the gallery, his gaze moving over the crowd as if he were scanning for something, or someone. Detectives later admitted it felt as though Marcus was attempting to project dominance, even from his position in chains. Marcus pleaded not guilty when the charges were read. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, assault, arson, and tampering with evidence across multiple states. His calm delivery of the plea caused an audible reaction from the crowd, many of whom were family members of his victims. For the victims' families, Marcus wasn't just a criminal, he was the embodiment of evil. They looked at him not as a man, but as the monster who had destroyed their lives. "I wanted to scream that first day in court," Sarah Avery's sister later recounted. "How could he just sit there so still like none of this even mattered?" But for Detective Harper, who sat in the front row, this trial wasn't about emotion, it was about ensuring justice prevailed. "This isn't his stage anymore," Harper said quietly to himself as he watched Marcus sit silently at the defense table. "We're taking that away from him." The prosecution's nightmare case. Leading the prosecution was attorney Melissa Carter, a tenacious litigator renowned for taking on high-profile cases and an expert in exposing manipulative personalities like Marcus Aldridge. Over the course of 3 hours, Carter delivered a searing opening statement that outlined the extent of Marcus's atrocities. "One by one their lives were stolen," Carter said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "Emily Grant, Sarah Avery, Rachel Torres. Each of them was lured into a trap designed by a master manipulator, a man who planned and calculated every step of their suffering. For these women's survival wasn't part of his design." Carter's words hung in the air like a heavy weight. She gestured toward the evidence table where sealed plastic bags containing duct tape, zip ties, knives, and photographs of the crime scenes were carefully laid out. "This," Carter said, her voice rising, "was Marcus Aldridge's signature. Pain wasn't just his tool, it was his goal." The prosecution called witness after witness, painting a grim mosaic of Marcus's crimes. Forensics experts broke down the scientific evidence with chilling precision, describing how DNA from the victims had been found on tools in Marcus's home and inside his abandoned vehicles. Fire investigators detailed the deliberate nature of his arsons, explaining how Marcus used gasoline to ensure his victims' bodies would be unrecognizable. His surviving victim, Jessica Harper, delivered the most gut-wrenching testimony. As she recounted her ordeal on the stand, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. "He told me I wasn't a person," Jessica said, tears streaming down her face. "He said I was something broken he could fix, or destroy, and he smiled while he said it." The trial was grueling, with the prosecution relentless in its pursuit of justice. Every piece of evidence was meticulously introduced, each crime scene photograph shown to the jury with stark and unforgiving clarity. Marcus's defense, a hollow argument. Despite Marcus Aldridge's overwhelming guilt, his defense team approached the case with a chilling strategy. They painted him as a mentally unstable loner who had been failed by society. They claimed his upbringing in a harsh household combined with a dissociative condition explained, though did not excuse, his actions. Their key witness, a private psychiatrist, testified that Marcus showed signs of antisocial personality disorder and trauma-related tendencies. While his actions are reprehensible, the defense lawyer argued, they are also the byproduct of a deeply damaged mind incapable of empathy or understanding the consequences of his crimes. But attorney Melissa Carter eviscerated this argument during cross-examination. "So you would have us believe that every act, The duct tape, the zip ties, the accelerant, the methodical planning was just the product of a broken mind? That Marcus Aldridge didn't know exactly what he was doing when he killed 3 women, nearly killed a 4th, and left an entire city living in fear? The psychiatrist hesitated. I would say he is culpable, but not entirely. Culpable, Carter interrupted, her voice sharp. That's all we need to hear. The jury's deliberation. After 46 days of grueling testimony, cross-examinations, and unimaginable details, the case was handed to the jury. For 3 days, the jurors deliberated over the mountains of evidence and horrifying accounts. The nation held its collective breath as they awaited a verdict. Finally, on October 14, 2008, the jury returned to the packed courtroom. The tension was unbearable as everyone stood while the foreperson read the decision. Guilty on all counts. Marcus Aldridge showed no outward reaction to the verdict. It was as though the words couldn't penetrate his calculated exterior. But in that moment, there was a collective sense of relief in the room, as though justice, though delayed, had finally prevailed. A sentence meant for evil. Judge Eleanor Briggs, who presided over the case, delivered her sentence with unflinching resolve. Marcus Aldridge, she said, her tone firm and unwavering, you have committed crimes so depraved, so calculated and unconscionable, that this court finds no alternative but to impose the maximum sentence allowed under the law. You are hereby sentenced to death. Applause broke out in the gallery as victims' families held each other, some weeping with relief. Marcus, shackled once again, simply stared ahead, his face a mask devoid of emotion. Detectives who had worked the case later admitted that seeing him led away in chains felt like a long overdue victory. A nation moved. The trial of Marcus Aldridge left an indelible mark on the nation. Coverage of the proceedings dominated headlines for weeks, with outraged citizens demanding greater protections for vulnerable women and increased penalties for predatory crimes. The families of his victims became activists, working to pass legislation aimed at improving public safety and victim advocacy programs. Speaking to reporters after the trial, Detective Harper summed up what everyone was feeling. This trial wasn't just about convicting Marcus Aldridge, it was about proving that people like him can't thrive in the shadows when we all stand together. He thought he could control everything, but today, justice took that away. From the haunting testimonies of his survivors to the pages of harrowing evidence introduced in court, Marcus Aldridge's trial became a cautionary tale about the capacity for human evil and the strength of a society determined to fight it. The legacy of the case. The case of Marcus Aldridge wasn't just a chilling tale of evil, it was a defining moment for the nation. His monstrous crimes and the unprecedented manhunt to capture him left scars on the communities he terrorized, but they also ignited a wave of reflection, reform, and resilience. As the dust settled following his trial and sentencing, the legacy of his reign of terror began to reveal itself, not only in the legal reforms that emerged, but in the way people confronted the darker corners of modern society. It was a case that shook America to its core and left an indelible mark, one that would be studied and remembered for generations to come. The law redefined. The Marcus Aldridge case exposed undeniable cracks in the criminal justice system, from how law enforcement tracked potential serial offenders to how communities failed to protect their most vulnerable. His ability to evade capture for so long, despite an obvious pattern of horrific crimes, was a wake-up call for law enforcement agencies across the United States. One of the defining legal changes that emerged in the aftermath of Aldridge's case was the creation of a centralized criminal profiling initiative overseen by the FBI. While criminal profiling had been in use for years, the Aldridge case highlighted the need for better data sharing between local, state, and federal authorities. Critics argued that Marcus had slipped through the cracks precisely because each jurisdiction treated his crimes as isolated incidents until it was too late. President George W. Bush, in his final year of office, signed the National Violent Crime Tracking Act of 2009, which established an integrated multi-agency system for tracking violent offenders across state lines. It ensured that law enforcement agencies, regardless of size or resources, could pool their data to identify patterns earlier. This act became commonly referred to in the media as the Aldridge Law. This law is critical, an FBI spokesperson stated during its announcement. Marcus Aldridge made it clear that communication, a breakdown within our own system of justice, was his best ally. We cannot allow that to happen again. Additionally, new legislation targeting the purchase and use of disposable burner phones one of Marcus's primary tools for avoiding detection, was proposed and gradually adopted by several states. Retailers now face stricter regulations when it came to tracking prepaid phone sales, ensuring that purchases linked to potential criminal behavior could be flagged more easily. Women's safety in the spotlight. The sheer brutality of Aldridge's crimes, specifically targeting young women, also sparked nationwide conversations about women's safety and how societal structures often fail to protect them. Women's advocacy groups rallied to turn the devastating nightmare of his case into momentum for change. Non-profit organizations such as We Rise Together and the Voices of the Lost were established in the aftermath of Aldridge's arrest. These organizations quickly became leaders in advocating for expanded resources and protections for victims of violence. They focused on empowering women to recognize red flags, take self-defense courses, and push for changes in local policies to combat stalking and harassment. "We can no longer operate as if this kind of suffering exists only in the shadows," said Catherine Torres, the older sister of journalist Rachel Torres, one of Aldridge's victims. Catherine became a leading voice in women's advocacy. "What happened to my sister could happen to anyone, and if we don't push for change, real change, then we let people like Marcus Aldridge win." Legislation was also implemented at the state level after months of pressure from victims' families. In Illinois, the Safe Connections Act made it easier for women to sever financial, technological, or legal ties to individuals suspected of predatory or abusive behavior. The act also created grants for increasing safety measures like public surveillance and better lighting in cities where violent crimes disproportionately targeted female populations. Community healing. For the neighborhoods and cities scarred by Marcus Aldridge's spree of terror, healing became a journey of resilience. Chicago, where his reign of fear began, saw local residents band together to rebuild a sense of shared safety. Block watches, something that had faded in prominence over the years, returned in full force as communities reclaimed their streets. One Chicago neighborhood held an annual candlelight vigil for years after Aldridge's trial, commemorating the lives lost. People gathered with photos of Emily Grant, Sarah Avery, Rachel Torres, and other unnamed victims thought to have crossed paths with Aldridge but were never conclusively linked to his crimes. "It's about remembering how precious life is," said one participant during the 5th anniversary of Aldridge's conviction. "We light these candles because for far too long he kept us in the dark." The case also reignited interest in urban crime prevention. City officials across Chicago invested in better public infrastructure, including increased police visibility, improved street lighting, and expanded surveillance technology in high-risk areas. While some decried these measures as invasive, others viewed them as necessary steps to ensure that predators like Marcus Aldridge couldn't operate undetected for so long. The psychological shadows. The haunting questions surrounding Marcus Aldridge's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom and continued to perplex psychologists and behavioral experts. What drove a man who, by all outward appearances, was ordinary to become a cold, calculating predator? Was Marcus an anomaly, or a product of societal and psychological failure? His journals, recovered during the investigation, became macabre artifacts for criminal psychology students, offering unsettling glimpses into the mind of a man obsessed with control, suffering, and destruction. Professors at major universities dissected Marcus's behavior in classrooms, using his case to inspire research on the prevention of violent tendencies in individuals who exhibit early warning signs. Dr. Elaine Prescott, one of the country's leading forensic psychologists, wrote extensively about Aldridge. "What makes Marcus unique isn't that he killed, that's sadly all too common. What makes him unique is how he executed his crimes with such precision and intellectual detachment, almost as if he viewed himself as an architect of suffering. He didn't crave chaos, he craved control." At the same time, the case revealed the need for greater mental health awareness across the country. Mental health experts and advocates pointed to Aldridge's early life, his harsh upbringing, his isolation, and his increasingly obsessive tendencies, as a missed opportunity for intervention. A cautionary tale. The story of Marcus Aldridge became more than just a horrific chapter in America's criminal history. It became a cautionary tale. Families, educators, and even policymakers began asking the hard questions. How do we ensure this doesn't happen again? How do we build systems that protect the vulnerable while holding predators accountable? Hollywood wasted no time producing true crime adaptations and documentaries about Aldridge. Major streaming services released specials under titles like The Shadow of Fear and The Architect of Pain. While some criticized the media for sensationalizing his story, others argued that keeping the conversation alive could help prevent future tragedies. A haunting reminder. For all the reforms, books, and advocacy movements that grew out of the case, Marcus Aldridge's legacy remains a painful reminder of humanity's capacity for darkness. His sinister grin during trial, his haunting journal entries, and the helplessness of many of his victims stayed etched in the nation's psyche long after his execution date was set. Detective James Harper, who had spent sleepless nights piecing together evidence, reflecting on the nightmare, summed it up best in an interview years later. Catching Marcus Aldridge didn't end the fear he caused, it didn't bring back the lives he stole, but it reminded us of what we're fighting for. Every law we pass, every victim we protect, it's a step toward a world where people like him have no place to hide. And so, the case of Marcus Aldridge became an enduring symbol, not just of the unimaginable horrors one human being can inflict on another, but of the resilience, determination, and courage it takes to confront that kind of evil head-on. Psychologist's analysis. As details of Marcus Aldridge's crimes came to light, it became clear to criminologists and psychologists alike that his case was far more than just another example of violent pathology. Aldridge's perfectly calculated methods, his cold demeanor during the trial, and the chilling contents of his personal journals left the scientific community grappling with one unsettling question: what could drive a man to descend into such deliberate and horrifying acts of cruelty? From interview rooms to lecture halls, debates raged over the psychological anatomy of Marcus Aldridge, what could have been done to stop him earlier, and what needs to be understood in order to prevent future predators like him. His case presented a macabre puzzle, one that peeled back the layers of human depravity while shaking many foundational assumptions about criminal behavior. A profile of control forensic psychologist Dr. Elaine Prescott became one of the leading voices in the analysis of Aldridge's psyche. Having analyzed some of the most notorious serial offenders of the 21st century, Prescott remarked that Aldridge's case stood apart due to his clinically detached and methodically obsessive nature. What makes Marcus Aldridge unique isn't just the scale of his crimes, Prescott wrote in an op-ed for the Criminal Mind Quarterly, but the precision with which he executed them. This was not a man acting out of impulse. This was someone whose every action was planned, catalogued, and most disturbingly, refined over time. Psychologists pinpointed Aldridge's obsession with control as the driving force behind his crimes. From the evidence found at crime scenes to his carefully detailed journals, Marcus demonstrated a chilling need to dominate every aspect of his surroundings and his victims. Dr. Prescott explained, in Marcus's mind, his victims weren't individuals with their own lives, hopes, or futures. They were subjects, tools for him to manipulate, study, and ultimately destroy. To Marcus, pain wasn't just a byproduct of his crimes, it was the goal. Through pain, he believed he could strip his victims of their humanity, leaving what he considered purity, a state free of hope, identity, or resistance. Early signs of danger. Investigating Marcus's upbringing revealed early warning signs of what psychologists refer to as antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. His childhood, described by neighbors and schoolmates as strict and isolating, was marked by emotional neglect and rigid authoritarian parenting. His father, a machinist, was said to have ruled the household with an iron fist, while his mother adhered to a strict, almost fanatical religious philosophy. Marcus reportedly exhibited problematic behavior as early as middle school, including harming small animals, lying compulsively, and bullying younger children. But teachers, preoccupied with his high academic performance in math and technology, dismissed these red flags. He was the quiet, brilliant kid in the corner, one former teacher recalled. You wouldn't expect the kid winning science fairs to be thinking about hurting people. Dr. Eric Calloway, a clinical psychiatrist specializing in childhood behavioral disorders, examined Marcus's early behavior through the lens of modern psychological research. The red flags were there, Calloway argued in a guest lecture at the University of Chicago. His childhood showed clear indicators of a child at risk of developing psychopathy, particularly his lack of empathy, inability to form meaningful emotional connections, and his tendency to view others as instruments, rather than equals. But the question remains, could anything have stopped Marcus Aldridge from becoming the monster he eventually became? Nurture versus nature. One of the most debated aspects of Marcus Aldridge's case was the age-old psychological debate of nurture versus nature. Was he born a predator, hardwired with a lack of empathy and a need for domination, Or did his environment, his cold, abusive upbringing and subsequent social isolation, create the killer he became? Researchers analyzing Aldridge's journals noted his disturbingly rational approach to his crimes. He didn't describe overwhelming rage, jealousy, or even hatred toward his victims. Instead, his writings revealed a man who believed in the superiority of control and regarded his victims as experiments in power dynamics. In one chilling entry uncovered during the investigation, Marcus wrote, "Free will is the ultimate illusion. I take that from them, and in doing so, I make them real. Pain removes the masks they wear. Pain reveals the truth." Dr. Lisa Ortega, a professor of criminal psychiatry at New York University, explained how such writings offer a rare glimpse into the mind of a high-functioning psychopath. Ortega defines individuals like Marcus as those who lack traditional emotional responses, such as empathy or guilt, but are exceptionally skilled at mimicking normal behavior to manipulate their surroundings. Marcus Aldridge didn't just lack empathy, he weaponized his understanding of what empathy should look like, Ortega said during an episode of Inside the Criminal Mind. He was meticulous in creating the illusion of being harmless when it suited him, and then, when the time came to strike, he became exactly what he wanted the world to fear, a calculating predator driven by the desire to dominate. The role of obsession. Though Marcus's personality was largely defined by antisocial and psychopathic traits, psychologists were quick to point out another defining characteristic of his psyche: obsession. His crimes were not random, they were carefully orchestrated over years, with each one becoming an iteration of what detectives described as his perverse pursuit of perfection. Dr. Prescott noted that Marcus's behavior mirrored what psychologists often identify in so-called architect killers, individuals who view their crimes as works of art. In Marcus's journals, we see the language of creation. He didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a creator, someone constructing moments of what he believed was purity through destruction. This obsession extended not only to his crimes but also to the way he avoided detection. Marcus's ability to navigate digital spaces, use burner phones, and leverage his technical skills to remain invisible for years demonstrated a level of compulsive precision that is rare among killers. What we learned. For the psychological community, Marcus Aldridge's case wasn't just a cautionary tale, it was a mirror, reflecting the dark potential of the human mind when left unchecked. His crimes became a subject of intense research, inspiring advancements in the spotting of early behavioral abnormalities and refining criminal profiling techniques. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, updated its profiling guidelines in the wake of the case, incorporating elements derived directly from Marcus's documented behavior. These updates highlighted the importance of recognizing obsession, social mimicry, and systematic planning as potential red flags for dangerous individuals hiding in plain sight. The hard truth. Perhaps the most haunting takeaway from Marcus Aldridge's case wasn't just the horror of what he did, it was the realization that people like him could so easily fall through the cracks. Dr. Calloway offered a sobering conclusion during a keynote speech in Chicago. Marcus Aldridge wasn't a sudden anomaly. He was the result of decades of neglect, from a childhood that ignored his budding cruelty to a society too preoccupied with the symptoms of evil to address its roots. If we truly want to stop the Marcus Aldridges of the world, we can't wait until they're holding the knife. We need to intervene when they're still in the classroom, staring into the void and daring us not to notice. A future shaped by horror. While the psychological legacy of Marcus Aldridge's case is grim, it also created a foundation for hope. Institutions, educators, and law enforcement agencies came together in the aftermath of his capture, vowing to learn from the scars he left behind. Forensic psychology programs continue to use his case as a cornerstone for understanding high-functioning psychopathy, obsession, and the role of control in predatory behavior. His journals, once a tool for his delusions, have been transformed into tools for prevention, guiding researchers toward greater insight into the minds of killers before it's too late. A warning from the darkness. Looking back at the case of Marcus Aldridge is like staring into the abyss, a chilling reminder of how darkness can take root in the most unassuming of places. Aldridge was not a man defined by impulsive rage or chaotic destruction. He was cold, meticulous, and calculated, a predator who found meaning not in life, but in the suffering he imposed on others. His story is more than a horrifying tale of violence. It is a stark lesson for society about complacency, vulnerability, and the thin line separating everyday life from tragedy. The legacy of Marcus Aldridge spans beyond the courtroom verdicts and legal reforms. It echoes as a warning that evil often hides in plain sight, and that it takes vigilance, action, and collective responsibility to ensure it doesn't thrive. The facade of normalcy. Perhaps the most haunting part of Marcus Aldridge's story is how unremarkable he seemed to those around him. He lived in quiet apartments, moved through crowded cities, and blended seamlessly into society. Neighbors described him as polite but aloof. Co-workers at the tech company where he worked years before his arrest recalled him as intelligent and focused but socially distant, a man who never raised alarms. This was Aldridge's greatest weapon, his ability to hide behind the mask of normalcy. At a glance, there was nothing dangerous about him. He wasn't the stereotypical image of a criminal. He didn't project menace or chaos. Instead, he existed quietly in the shadows, meticulously planning each act of horror with an unnerving patience. "Evil doesn't always shout," said Detective James Harper in an interview years after the case. "Sometimes it just quietly whispers in the corner, waiting for you to let your guard down." Marcus didn't hunt in broad daylight. He thrived when people turned their backs, assuming they were safe. Marcus's ability to evade suspicion for years raises an unsettling question. How many others like him walk among us unnoticed? And how can society learn to recognize the signs before it's too late? The thin line between safety and danger, the Marcus Aldridge case stripped away the illusion of safety from many communities. In Chicago, where his spree of terror began, the fear he left behind was palpable. People canceled nightly plans, avoided isolated areas, and double-checked every lock on their doors. Women, especially, became hyper-aware in their daily lives, carrying pepper spray and walking in groups. The idea that someone like Aldridge had been living among them, planning his atrocities, shattered the sense of security that often shields urban life. But Aldridge's darkness was not limited to his crimes. His legacy forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily cracks in the system allow predators to operate. The fact that Aldridge was able to move through state lines, exploit burner phones, and avoid detection for so long revealed systemic gaps in law enforcement coordination and public safety infrastructure. His story is every person's nightmare. Catherine Torres, sister of Aldridge's victim Rachel Torres, stated during a victim awareness conference, "You're living your life, going out for groceries, heading to work, and there's a Marcus Aldridge nearby, watching, waiting. It's terrifying, but we can't live in fear. We have to fight back." Vigilance against the shadows. One of the most critical messages the Aldridge case leaves behind is the importance of vigilance, both at the individual and institutional levels. In the years following his arrest, community action groups and victim advocacy organizations sought to empower individuals to recognize warning signs of predatory behavior. These movements encouraged people to trust their instincts, report suspicious activity, and engage with their neighborhoods to create environments less conducive to crime. Experts also highlighted a need for cultural change. Dr. Lisa Ortega, a psychiatrist who analyzed Aldridge's psychological profile, argued that society's fixation on external appearances often blinds it to deeper, more subtle dangers. As a culture, we're easily distracted by stereotypes, Ortega explained during a national panel on criminal psychology. Marcus Aldridge played on that. He didn't look the part of a violent predator, and because of that he was able to stay invisible for years. If we're going to prevent future cases like his, we need to move beyond these assumptions. At the institutional level, law enforcement agencies began adapting their strategies. Programs were developed to train officers in community engagement, emphasizing the importance of building trust with vulnerable groups and encouraging open lines of communication. The Marcus Aldridge case served as a grim reminder that no city or person was immune to danger, but it also sparked a renewed commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The human cost of complacency. At its core, the Marcus Aldridge case was not just about the crimes he committed, but about the system that let him slip through the cracks. He exploited societal loopholes, a justice system that struggled to connect the dots across state borders, a technological landscape that allowed anonymous activities, and a public that often ignored red flags out of fear or disbelief. For too long we've relied on the idea that it could never happen here to keep us comfortable, said Dr. Eric Calloway, a clinical psychiatrist. But comfort is a dangerous thing when you're dealing with someone like Marcus. He counted on it, and we let him get away with it for too long. Marcus's story carries a harsh truth. Society often overlooks its most vulnerable members. Many of Aldridge's victims were young, independent women, women who were targeted for their isolation and perceived invisibility. Advocacy groups like the Voices of the Lost now work to ensure that no one suffers in silence again, offering education, resources, and support to those living in dangerous situations. A call to action. If there is one lasting lesson from the Marcus Aldridge case, it is this. Darkness thrives in silence. It thrives when people look the other way, when systems fail to connect, and when communities forget their shared responsibility. Aldridge's story is a dire warning that vigilance is not optional, it is necessary. But his story is also a call to action. For every moment of horror he inflicted, there has been an equal and opposite movement toward resilience. From legislative reforms like the National Violent Crime Tracking Act of 2009 to grassroots neighborhood programs, the world is slowly learning to fight back against the shadows. Evil doesn't win when we catch someone like Marcus Aldridge, Catherine Torres stated at a national forum on women's safety. It wins when we forget the lessons his story forces us to confront. Complacency is his victory. Vigilance is ours. Turning fear into strength. The tragedy of Marcus Aldridge's case will never truly fade from memory. It is etched into the hearts of victims' families, into the laws that now bear his legacy, and into the nightmares of those who fear the darkness he embodied. But as heinous as his crimes were, they have sparked a collective reckoning, one that reminds us all of what lies on the other side of fear: courage, resilience, and action. Detective James Harper, reflecting on the case years later, spoke of the enduring lesson it left behind. We don't get to choose whether evil exists. People like Marcus Aldridge remind us it's always there, waiting for an opportunity. But what we can choose is how we respond. Marcus's story isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a reminder of why we can't afford to sit in the silence of fear, because at the end of the day, it's not just about fighting the darkness, it's about making sure the light never goes out. A bridge between fear and hope. The Marcus Aldridge case remains a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for darkness, but it also illuminates the ways we can rise above it. Through education, reform, and collective effort, his story has become more than a tragedy. It has become a turning point. A warning, yes, but also a call to build a society where shadows no longer have a place to hide.